At a dazzling high society party, a millionaire mocked his wife with cruel jokes to impress his stunning mistress. But while guests laughed, a mysterious stranger revealed a secret so explosive it shattered everything. In minutes, admiration turned to horror, and the man who thought he owned the room was left utterly humiliated. The grand hall glittered with excess, chandeliers dripping with crystals, golden trays balancing champagne flutes, and strings of live violins painting the air with elegance. Laughter echoed in polished marble corridors while murmurs of power laced every conversation. Outside, a valet line of luxury cars wrapped around the estate like a parade of wealth. It wasn't just a party. It was a display, a carefully orchestrated symphony of status and influence, curated by none other than Richard Halston, the millionaire who thrived on spectacle. He stood near the grand staircase, dressed in a perfectly tailored tuxedo, diamond cufflinks catching the light like his smug smirk. His salt and pepper hair was combed back with the precision of a man who liked control. Around him, laughter followed wherever he turned, part performance, part dominance. But tonight, the spotlight wasn't just on Richard. It was also, perhaps unintentionally, on Evelyn, his wife. Evelyn Halston moved gracefully through the crowd, clad in a deep emerald gown that complemented her auburn hair twisted elegantly into a low chignon. Her beauty was quiet, refined, and often overlooked in rooms that prized ostentation. She nodded politely to the guests, holding a glass of wine with the composure of a woman used to being politely ignored. And yet, her eyes noticed everything, especially the glances Richard kept stealing toward the young blonde beside him. Delilah Stone, barely 30, stunning, loud in appearance and presence, wore a sequined red dress that left little to the imagination. She clung to Richard's arm with a familiarity that drew raised brows and knowing smirks. She was introduced to others as a close business associate, but no one believed that, least of all Evelyn. The truth danced behind every champagne bubble. Delilah was not just a guest. She was the new center of gravity in Richard's orbit. As guests gathered near the central fountain where a live pianist played a dramatic tune, Richard took a glass and tapped it lightly with a fork. The sound rang sharp, slicing through conversations and drawing all eyes toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice soaked in pride, "I want to thank you all for coming tonight. It's not every day we get to celebrate success and legacy under one roof." Applause followed, polite and shallow. Evelyn stood at his side, smiling faintly, but her grip on her glass tightened slightly. "And, of course," Richard continued, turning to her with a practiced grin, "I wouldn't be here without the constant support of my beautiful wife. Always so gracious, even if she prefers staying in the shadows rather than basking in the spotlight." There was a soft wave of laughter. A few chuckled awkwardly. Evelyn's smile didn't falter, but her eyes flicked toward him with something unreadable. Richard wasn't done. "You know," he said, swirling his glass, "Evelyn has this charming ability to make an entire room forget she's in it. It's truly a gift." More laughter now, stronger, encouraged by alcohol and social obligation. Delilah giggled, pressing her hand over her lips like a schoolgirl hearing gossip. Evelyn's cheeks flushed, but she said nothing. Her posture remained perfect, her gaze unmoved. Richard was enjoying himself too much. And yet, somehow, she always knows what's going on, quiet as a mouse, but sharp as a knife. "Isn't that right, dear?" The crowd turned to Evelyn, awaiting her response, some out of curiosity, others in discomfort. She raised her glass slightly, smiled faintly, and replied with calm poise, "Better to be sharp and quiet than loud and dull." A subtle shift in the room. A few stifled laughs. Richard's smile faltered just briefly, and Delilah's laughter died in her throat. Evelyn lowered her glass and turned slightly, walking away with measured grace, leaving behind a stunned silence that lingered awkwardly in the space where her dignity remained untouched. Richard chuckled again, louder this time, trying to recover his moment. "Well, she always did have a way with words," he said, but no one was really listening anymore. Eyes followed Evelyn as she stepped into the garden terrace, her silhouette illuminated by the glow of vintage lanterns and moonlight. Alone, she leaned on the railing, gazing out at the trees swaying gently in the night breeze, the sounds of the party growing faint behind her. What none of the guests noticed was the man standing quietly near the corner of the terrace, partially veiled in shadow. He had arrived late, unnoticed, dressed in a simple gray suit that didn't match the grandeur of the event but carried its own presence. His eyes didn't follow the crowd or the performance inside. His eyes were fixed on Evelyn. He took a sip from his glass, unmoved by the laughter or the spectacle. There was a quiet calculation behind his stare, the kind that suggested he hadn't come just to celebrate, but to observe, to assess, to wait. Back inside, Delilah clung to Richard tighter, whispering something in his ear. He smirked again, too intoxicated by ego to notice the shift in the room's energy. Some guests were whispering now, not about the grandeur of the evening, but about the slap of Evelyn's subtle response. Others simply exchanged glances that said more than words. As the music played and conversations resumed, the air carried something different, an undertone of tension, of something unsaid but heavy. Evelyn returned briefly, moving through the crowd with her head high, acknowledging guests, offering smiles, as if nothing had happened. But her eyes, just for a moment, met those of the stranger by the terrace. They held there, long enough to suggest familiarity, but too brief for anyone to notice. The party carried on. The laughter returned, but something had cracked in Richard's perfect facade. He didn't realize it yet, but the night that began with arrogance would not end the way he imagined. His humiliation was only beginning, and the secret that would unravel everything was already in the room, watching, waiting, and ready to strike when the time was right. And let me ask you something. If you were Evelyn, standing there being humiliated in front of all those people, what would you have done? Tell me in the comments. Rate the story from 0 to 10 so far. Hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe, because trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. The clink of crystal and echo of laughter still reverberated through the mansion even after the last guest had left. The aftermath of the party was a faint hum of emptiness, broken only by the occasional whisper between house staff cleaning up. In the master bedroom on the second floor, Evelyn Halston sat on the edge of the chaise near the window, slowly removing the pins from her hair. One by one, they dropped onto the vanity table, each tiny clink marking the unraveling of yet another part of the evening she had endured in silence. The mirror reflected her face, composed, distant, but slightly strained at the corners. Her emerald gown pulled around her like spilled paint, elegant and heavy with the weight of pretense. Richard walked in moments later, loosening his bow tie with a self-satisfied air, his eyes scanning the room without acknowledging her. "Quite the success tonight," he said, more to himself than to her. Evelyn didn't respond. She placed the last pin down and reached for a hairbrush, slowly dragging it through her thick auburn strands. "You embarrassed me," she finally said, her voice calm but steely, not raising it, not accusing, just stating a fact. Richard scoffed, pouring himself a drink from the bar cabinet. "Oh, come on, Evelyn. It was a joke." Everyone laughed. "Don't be so dramatic." "Everyone laughed because they had to," she replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "They weren't laughing at your wit. They were laughing at your cruelty." "Cruelty," he said, now turning to face her, his voice taking on a sharper tone. "You're overreacting. You always play the victim when the spotlight isn't on you." "I never wanted the spotlight," she said, standing slowly. "But I also never asked to be your punchline." He waved his hand dismissively, walking past her toward the bathroom. "You take everything so seriously. Maybe that's the problem. You've forgotten how to enjoy anything." Evelyn watched him disappear into the other room, her lips pressed together. The sound of running water echoed for a while, followed by silence. When Richard returned, robe tied loosely around his waist, he found Evelyn already under the covers, facing away from him. He didn't say goodnight. Neither did she. By morning, the tension had hardened into silence. Richard sat in the breakfast room scrolling through his phone while Evelyn sipped her tea, reading a book. The air between them was colder than the untouched croissants on the table. "Delilah called," Richard said suddenly, as if it were a passing remark. Evelyn turned a page in her book without looking up. She said she left her bracelet in the lounge. Asked if I'd check for it. "Of course," Evelyn replied flatly. "Wouldn't want her to lose anything else." "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Nothing," she replied, lifting her teacup to her lips, hiding the slight curve of her smile. Later that day, Evelyn walked through the garden, stopping to greet staff and check on the seasonal blooms. The mansion grounds were always pristine, meticulously kept, just like the image Richard projected to the world. But beneath that perfection, Evelyn saw the cracks. The staff exchanged glances when he passed. Some avoided him altogether. Delilah's presence at events had begun to raise eyebrows, not just among friends, but investors, partners, even the press. Whispers were spreading, quiet but persistent. People were starting to talk. Evelyn knew Richard didn't care. He was too confident in his position, too arrogant to believe anyone would dare challenge his standing. And perhaps, for a long time, they wouldn't. But reputations crumble not from earthquakes, but from the steady drip of water, unnoticed until the structure collapses. That evening, Evelyn walked into the study where Richard was sipping whiskey and reviewing documents. "I'm heading to the charity board meeting tomorrow," she said. "Thought I'd let you know." "You're still wasting time with that?" he muttered without looking up. "It's not a waste," she said firmly. "Unlike hosting parties to feed your ego." He looked up sharply, eyes narrowing. "Is that what you think I do?" "It's what everyone sees you doing." There was a pause, long enough for the tension to thicken. Richard stood and walked over to her. "Careful, Evelyn," he said, voice low. "You're starting to sound resentful." "Resentment requires surprise," she replied, stepping past him. "And I stopped being surprised by you a long time ago." In the hallway, Evelyn paused by a large portrait of their wedding day. She stared at her younger self in the frame, hopeful, radiant, naive. She remembered that day vividly, not because of joy, but because it was the day she made a choice she hadn't fully understood. Richard hadn't married her out of love. She knew that now. Perhaps she always had. Their union had been strategic. She was well-bred, poised, and from a family that had once held influence. Her presence beside him added credibility, stability, tradition. But she hadn't expected to be shelved like an antique vase, admired occasionally, but always peripheral. As months passed, she had slowly been pushed further out of Richard's world, less included in decisions, less consulted, less seen. Delilah was only the latest symptom of a deeper rot. But Evelyn wasn't broken. She was watching, waiting, preparing. Upstairs, Richard stood by his window, watching her walk across the lawn below. He felt a prickle of something unfamiliar, guilt, perhaps, or maybe fear. He didn't know what bothered him more, her silence or her strength. He turned away from the window, dialing his assistant. "Get Delilah on the line," he said. "Tell her we need to move forward on that private villa in Capri." As the phone rang, he failed to notice the faint movement in the shadows of the trees, a figure standing at a distance, watching, listening, waiting. It began subtly, almost invisibly, as most significant storms do. While Richard basked in his illusion of invincibility, a quiet presence began weaving itself into the fabric of their lives. A man whose name no one seemed to know, yet whose eyes noticed everything. He didn't wear the polished arrogance of the social elite, nor did he move with the desperation of those trying to fit in. He was just there, hovering at the edges of events, always present, yet never intrusive, the kind of figure most people dismissed, and Richard never even registered. But Evelyn noticed. She noticed everything. It was at the art gala the following week that he appeared again, standing near a sculpture installation, speaking softly with one of the waiters. Evelyn watched him from a distance, her gaze lingering longer than it should have. He wasn't dressed like the usual guests, no tailored tux, no ostentatious accessories. A plain dark suit, understated shoes, a leather notebook tucked beneath his arm. But there was a calm certainty about him, the way he carried himself like a man who had already seen the ending of the story before anyone else had finished reading the first chapter. Later that evening, Evelyn saw him again by the refreshments table, pretending to admire a painting but actually watching the room. Their eyes met briefly. He didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply looked at her as if they'd already met in another time, another life. And then he turned away, vanishing into the crowd. At home, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She sat near the fireplace, the soft flickering light casting shadows across the room. Her mind kept circling back to that man. His eyes, the way he observed, the strange familiarity. She didn't tell Richard. He wouldn't care. Or worse, he'd start asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. But something inside her stirred, an unease wrapped in curiosity. Days passed, and the stranger appeared again, this time at a luncheon hosted by a mutual acquaintance. He didn't mingle, didn't make small talk, but his eyes were always scanning. Evelyn approached him, cautious but purposeful. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced," she said. He turned to her slowly, as if he'd been expecting her. "No, we haven't," he replied. "But I know who you are, Mrs. Halston." His voice was smooth, calm, not threatening, but undeniably layered. "Do you?" she asked, her tone light but alert. "Yes," he said, "and I also know a lot about your husband." She paused. Her grip on her clutch tightened slightly. "Is that so?" He nodded. "Let's just say I'm interested in the stories people hide behind their reputations." "And what interest could that possibly serve?" she asked, trying to keep her voice even. "That depends," he replied, his tone more ambiguous now. "Sometimes it serves justice. Sometimes it serves closure." Before she could respond, someone called her name. She turned briefly. When she looked back, he was gone again, absorbed by the crowd like smoke into the wind. Later that night, Evelyn sat by her desk, flipping through old photographs and documents. Something about the man's face scratched at the edge of her memory, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't place it. She picked up the phone and called one of her contacts from the charity board, someone with access to city archives and event registries. "I need a list of all recent guests registered for the past 3 events," she said, "especially those not listed on the original invitations." Her contact hesitated, but Evelyn's voice was firm. "No questions. Just send it." Meanwhile, Richard remained blissfully unaware. He spent most of his time managing his business, entertaining Delilah, and hosting more meaningless parties. His world, though carefully curated, was beginning to fray at the edges, but he mistook the unraveling threads for manageable wrinkles. Delilah, however, began to notice the shift. She didn't like how Evelyn was suddenly more composed, more present. She had expected her to fade further into the background, not stand taller in the face of constant humiliation. "Something's off with her," Delilah told Richard one night. They were in his study, sipping cognac, the air thick with vanity. "She's not reacting the way she used to." "She's playing stoic," Richard replied dismissively. "It's what women do when they feel they're losing." "No," Delilah said, her brows drawn. "She's watching, listening, planning maybe." "Planning what?" he scoffed. "To write a tell-all memoir about my terrible dinner jokes." Delilah didn't laugh. Her intuition told her something deeper was stirring, something she couldn't quite name yet. A few days later, Evelyn received an unmarked envelope at the mansion. Inside was a photograph, an old one. A younger Richard shaking hands with another man in a boardroom. Behind them, a small company logo etched on a glass panel, Lindale Holdings. Evelyn's heart paused. Lindale. She hadn't heard that name in years. A memory surfaced, her father once speaking about that company, about how it had been destroyed by a hostile acquisition. He'd been furious, hurt, betrayed. But back then, she hadn't known the details. She hadn't cared to ask. The photo was dated 11 years ago. Richard had never spoken of Lindale. Attached to the photograph was a note. "Ask him about what happened after this meeting. Ask him who paid the price." That night, Evelyn placed the photo on Richard's desk without a word. She said nothing during dinner, nothing before bed. But when Richard found it later and stormed into the bedroom, eyes blazing, she was ready. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "A guest," she said calmly, brushing her hair. "Why? Does it trouble you?" "This is old history," he snapped. "Buried and irrelevant." "History only feels irrelevant to those who didn't bleed because of it," she replied. "I didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. "Business is business." Evelyn turned toward him, eyes sharp. "And what happens when business ruins lives? When a decision made in that boardroom sends families into poverty? You've always called it strategy. I wonder how others would name it." Richard didn't respond. He walked out, slamming the door. Evelyn sat silently for a long time afterward, staring at her reflection. Something was unraveling, not just in him, but in her too. Something long buried, something waiting to come to the surface. And somewhere out there, the stranger was still watching, still waiting. Delilah was never one to settle for second place. From the moment she stepped into Richard Halston's world, she had studied every angle, measured every opportunity, and played her cards with ruthless precision. She hadn't clawed her way through the fashion and social scene to be anyone's side note. She wanted power, permanence, and position. And Evelyn, no matter how elegant or composed, was an obstacle she fully intended to erase. The morning after the photograph incident, Delilah sat across from Richard at breakfast, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, while watching him flip through the paper with growing irritation. His jaw was tense, brow furrowed, lips pressed in a thin line. She knew something had rattled him, though he hadn't yet shared what. "You look like you lost a merger," she teased, sipping from her cup. "Or maybe you just realized your wife is more cunning than you gave her credit for." Richard glanced at her sharply, but she held his stare, unwavering. "She's poking around," he said finally. "She left an old photo on my desk. One from a deal I thought was long buried." "So bury it deeper," Delilah said, brushing a strand of golden hair behind her ear. "Better yet, bury her." Richard gave a half laugh, but Delilah saw something in his eyes, hesitation. He wasn't as unshakable as he used to be, and that made her nervous. "She's not just sulking anymore," she continued, voice low. "She's watching, learning, preparing. You've underestimated her for too long, Richard." "You're starting to sound paranoid," he muttered. "No," Delilah said, leaning forward, her tone sharpening. "I'm being realistic. You need to get ahead of this. Push her out completely. Make it clear to everyone that you've moved on." He didn't respond right away, but the seed was planted. Over the next few days, Delilah took more initiative. She inserted herself into meetings, whispered suggestions in Richard's ear before board calls, and began speaking to the staff with an air of authority that hadn't been granted to her. When Evelyn entered a room, Delilah would already be there, comfortably seated in the chair that had once belonged to the lady of the house. Her comments became bolder, her presence more invasive. She questioned Evelyn's involvement in charity work, mocked her outdated fashion choices, and once even joked in front of guests that Evelyn must have married Richard before he could afford taste. Richard didn't stop her. In fact, he often smirked, as if silently endorsing the behavior. But Evelyn didn't retaliate. She didn't lower herself to Delilah's level. She simply observed, each insult met with silence, each provocation absorbed with eerie grace. Yet beneath that silence, Delilah sensed something she couldn't name. Not defeat, not indifference. Something else, something colder. One evening, after Richard returned from a business trip, he found Delilah waiting in his study. She wore a silk robe, wine glass in hand, eyes sharp with purpose. "I want her out," she said before he could even greet her. "It's time. Make her leave." Richard sighed, tossing his briefcase onto the chair. "It's not that simple. We have an image to maintain, legal ties, press appearances." "Then make it simple," she snapped. "File for separation. Claim incompatibility. Leak a story about her mental state if you have to. But do something." Richard turned to her, surprised by the intensity in her voice. "Are you trying to take her place, Delilah?" he asked, a note of amusement in his tone. "Is that so hard to imagine?" she replied. "I've been by your side for months. I've navigated your parties, your business contacts, your temper. I deserve more than a shadow role." "You want the title," he said flatly. "I want the throne," she corrected. Richard considered her for a long moment. Delilah was a different kind of ambitious, unapologetic and blunt. She wasn't Evelyn, who played the long game with patience and silence. Delilah moved fast, struck first, and worried about consequences later. But that very trait was beginning to unsettle him. She was no longer just a distraction. She was becoming a threat of her own. The next day, Evelyn received a notice from Richard's legal counsel. Formal documentation requesting a restructuring of marital assets and a proposed separation of living arrangements. No mention of divorce yet, but the message was clear. She was being pushed aside. She read the letter slowly, then folded it neatly and placed it on the tray beside her tea. No visible reaction, no tears, no fury. Just a quiet nod, as if confirming something she already suspected. But in her eyes, something shifted. A storm brewing behind glass. Later that week, Richard hosted a luncheon at the estate, inviting several key investors and business associates. Delilah was dressed to dazzle, seated beside him like a queen in waiting. Evelyn was notably absent from the main table, placed instead at the far end, where few would notice her. But the few who did were surprised by her calm demeanor. She spoke little but observed everything. Midway through the event, a courier arrived, an envelope addressed to Richard. He opened it casually, then froze. Inside was another photograph, this one of a closed-door meeting between Richard and a former board member now under investigation for corporate fraud. Scribbled on the back were the words, "How much is loyalty worth when built on deception?" Richard paled, folding the photo quickly and slipping it into his jacket pocket. Delilah noticed his reaction and leaned in. "What is it?" "Nothing," he muttered. "Just business." But Evelyn saw it from her seat across the room. His sudden stillness, the tremor in his fingers. And she smiled faintly. Delilah sensed the shift too. She pressed Richard later that evening, demanding answers. "Someone's playing games," he said. "Trying to rattle me. Or trying to expose you," she replied. "You've made enemies, Richard. Maybe more than you realize." He dismissed her concerns, but that night, he barely slept. The shadows in his empire were growing darker. And though Delilah clung tighter, offering comfort, strategy, even intimacy, Richard began to feel the weight of her ambition pressing against him like a vice. He started to see in her the same hunger he once admired but now feared. She wasn't a partner. She was a weapon with a mind of her own. Delilah, meanwhile, was growing impatient. The more she tried to force Evelyn out, the more Evelyn seemed to grow stronger, even in silence. It unnerved her. One afternoon, she caught Evelyn in the garden, seated with a book. She approached with a forced smile, feigning casual conversation. "Must be nice," she said, looking around. "To spend your days like this, watching flowers grow while the rest of us build futures." Evelyn closed her book and looked up slowly. Not everything worth building needs noise and chaos. Some things bloom in silence. Delilah's smile tightened. "Enjoy it while it lasts," she said. "Change is coming." "Yes," Evelyn replied softly. "It is." The air inside the Halston estate grew heavier by the day, not from the scent of perfumed flowers arranged daily by the staff, nor from the lingering aroma of aged wine in crystal decanters. It was something far less tangible, something that settled quietly between every hallway and whisper, in the silence of every unsaid word and the echo of every forced laugh. Evelyn Halston moved through this environment like a ghost wrapped in velvet, graceful yet increasingly distant. But those who paid attention would have noticed the subtle shift in her presence. She no longer seemed resigned to the shadows. She was studying them. While Delilah strutted through the corridors with increasing confidence, Evelyn had taken to retreating into spaces no longer visited by her husband or his mistress. The West Wing library became her refuge, its towering shelves and warm oak panels offering her something neither Richard nor his empire could provide: solace and strategy. She sat often beneath the old skylight, reading, writing, quietly analyzing everything that had begun to unfold. She wasn't idle. She wasn't indifferent. She was preparing. The staff, who had once seen her as a polite but detached figurehead, began to notice her differently now. She asked questions, not about flowers or dinner arrangements, but about timing, changes in schedules, the comings and goings of Richard's guests. She remembered names, noticed patterns, listened when people thought she wasn't paying attention. And gradually, the staff began responding to her with something deeper than politeness. There was a growing respect, even admiration, for the woman who remained calm while her dignity was chipped away in public. Because while Richard and Delilah ruled the house loudly, Evelyn was beginning to reclaim it quietly. One afternoon, she sat with Margaret, the longtime housekeeper, over tea in the conservatory. Their conversations had once been limited to event planning and menu options. But now, Evelyn leaned in a little closer, asked about certain deliveries, certain names that had begun appearing more frequently in correspondence addressed to Richard. Margaret, hesitant at first, eventually began to speak more openly. "There's a man who's been calling the staff line," she said in a low voice. "Doesn't leave his name, but he asks about the household schedules. He said he used to work with Mr. Halston." Evelyn listened carefully. "Has he said what he wants?" "Not yet," Margaret replied. "But he's persistent." That evening, Evelyn sat by her window, watching the driveway beyond the fountain where the moonlight reflected on water. A black car had parked across the street, not in the estate, but just far enough to be unnoticed by most. Inside it, she saw the silhouette of a man, the same one from the gala, the same one who had left her the photo. The following day, Evelyn visited a small bookstore downtown, one she used to frequent before her life had become a series of lavish appearances. She wore sunglasses and a scarf, understated but elegant. At the back of the store, she found him waiting. He was flipping through a newspaper, but looked up the moment she entered. "You've been watching us," she said quietly. "Why?" He closed the paper, stood slowly. "Because your husband built his empire on ashes," he said. "And I'm here to make sure the truth sees daylight." "And me?" she asked. "What do you want from me?" "Nothing," he replied. "But you deserve to know how deep the betrayal goes. You've only scratched the surface." He handed her another envelope. This time it was thicker, heavier. Inside were documents, copies of contracts, financial trails, business agreements linked to names Evelyn hadn't heard in years. But one name caught her eye, her own. Or more specifically, her maiden name. The company her family once owned was on the list of Richard's acquisitions. A deal signed without her knowledge, finalized days after their honeymoon. It had been absorbed and dismantled, sold in pieces, erased from public record. When Evelyn returned to the estate, she didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply walked into the sitting room, poured herself a glass of water, and sat down. Her heart beat steadily, her thoughts even clearer than before. Now she understood. Now the humiliation, the indifference, the calculated disregard, it all made sense. She had never been Richard's partner. She had been his alibi, a token to validate the mask of respectability while he destroyed the very legacy her family once stood for. Over the following weeks, Evelyn's presence in the social circuit grew more visible again, not as a devoted wife, but as an independent figure. She accepted invitations to galas and charity events alone, where she spoke eloquently, dressed with understated confidence, and never mentioned Richard's name. People noticed. The press began taking interest. Articles began to surface, not about the millionaire's glamorous mistress, but about the dignified woman whose quiet strength radiated louder than any headline scandal. Delilah, increasingly frustrated, confronted Richard. "She's turning the narrative around," she said. "You're losing grip. People are watching her now, not you." "Let them watch," Richard snapped. "She's still wearing my name." "Not for long," Delilah replied coldly. But Evelyn was never interested in a name. She was reclaiming her identity. One evening, she visited the old family property her father once managed before it had been sold off. It was abandoned now, overgrown and silent. She walked through it with reverent steps, touching walls she hadn't seen in over a decade. Her eyes filled with tears, not from sorrow, but from resolve. She would restore it, not for legacy, but for justice. As the sun set behind the trees, Evelyn stood in the middle of the empty lot and called her lawyer. "I want a full audit of Halston Enterprises," she said. "Every acquisition, every asset, especially anything tied to Lindale Holdings." The lawyer hesitated. "That'll raise flags, Evelyn." "Good," she replied. "Let them wave." The next morning, Richard received a notice of audit from one of his subsidiary branches. He was livid. "Who's behind this?" he barked at his assistant. "I want names." It came anonymously through legal channels, the assistant said nervously. "But there's a signature on the request. Evelyn Halston." Richard dropped the document. His hands trembled slightly, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not annoyance, not irritation, but fear. A creeping realization that perhaps this wasn't a silent resistance after all. Perhaps it was a declaration of war. Rain fell steadily that morning, tapping against the estate windows like a soft percussion, adding a rhythmic tension to the silence within. Richard stood in his study, a glass of scotch in one hand, the audit notice trembling slightly in the other. The words stared back at him with merciless finality, Evelyn Halston. Her signature at the bottom of the document wasn't flamboyant or angry. It was neat, precise, deliberate, a dagger disguised as civility. He dropped the paper onto his desk and paced the room, running his hand through his graying hair, the weight of the past beginning to crowd his mind like ghosts knocking on the door he'd sealed shut for years. He tried to shake it off, muttering that it was just a legal formality, something easily handled by lawyers and accountants. But a seed of doubt had taken root, and no amount of scotch could drown it. He hadn't expected her to act. He had misjudged her. He thought Evelyn was too passive, too refined, too bound by her upbringing to engage in anything beyond polite resistance. But something had changed. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was retaliating. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued her quiet campaign. In the following days, she coordinated with her legal team, requesting records from Halston Enterprises and cross-referencing transactions from over a decade ago. It was tedious work, the kind that most people would leave to lawyers and auditors. But Evelyn combed through every contract, every signature, every name on those documents, searching for something deeper. It wasn't just about a business loss. It wasn't just about her family's company being dismantled. It was about discovering the full extent of Richard's betrayal, the blueprint of his rise to power, layer by layer. One name kept resurfacing: Lindale Holdings. It had been buried beneath a series of shell companies, dissolved quietly after the acquisition. But what drew Evelyn's attention was the timeline. The deal had been signed just days after their honeymoon, while she was still unpacking suitcases and writing thank you notes for wedding gifts. Richard had orchestrated it under her nose, leveraging her family's trust to secure insider access. He had stolen her father's legacy and profited from it while she shared a breakfast table with him. Evelyn wasn't the only one digging. The mysterious stranger from the gala, whose name she now knew as Marcus Vale, had begun conducting his own investigation. He wasn't merely a concerned citizen or a bitter former associate. He was a journalist, once respected in investigative circles before being blacklisted for exposing corruption in high places like Halston Enterprises. He had been watching Richard for years, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment to strike. Evelyn, though initially unaware of his full motives, had become a natural ally in his search for the truth. Marcus visited Evelyn again, this time not in secret, but in her own study. The meeting was brief but pointed. "It wasn't just about your family," he said, placing a folder on her desk. "Richard's history is a trail of destruction. He crushed small businesses, manipulated asset values, coerced shareholders. Your family was one of many, but it was the most personal for him. He needed to erase your father's name to ensure his own legacy." Evelyn opened the folder slowly. Inside were testimonies from former employees, handwritten letters from small business owners, legal documents indicating shady mergers, and worst of all, a report linking Richard to an internal cover-up involving a collapsed manufacturing plant that had once employed dozens of workers, many of whom lost pensions and savings in the fallout. And there, buried among the pages, was an email thread, one that chilled Evelyn to her core. It was correspondence between Richard and a former board member, written during their honeymoon. In one email, Richard explicitly discussed leveraging his marriage to Evelyn to secure compliance from her father. He had referred to her as the key to the lock, not as a partner, not as a wife, but as a strategic asset. That night, Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, rereading the words over and over. Her mind was quiet, her heart heavy. Not because she was surprised. She wasn't. Somewhere deep down, a part of her had always suspected her marriage was less about love and more about leverage. But seeing it in writing, so cold, so transactional, shattered something sacred. The man she had once promised her life to had never even seen her as a person, just a means to an end. Meanwhile, Richard tried to regain control of the narrative. He doubled down on public appearances, published statements, and even staged a media-friendly charity event to divert attention from the growing whispers. Delilah stood by his side, dazzling as ever, her smiles carefully practiced, her touch calculated. But the crowd wasn't watching them with admiration anymore. They were watching with curiosity, with skepticism. The tone had shifted. Even business partners started to grow wary. Meetings were rescheduled. Investors grew colder. The press began probing deeper, asking questions about old deals, referencing obscure companies. Richard noticed the change but dismissed it as temporary. He believed his name still carried weight, still instilled fear. But the truth was beginning to loosen his grip, and he couldn't see it yet. One morning, Evelyn received a package at her private address. Inside was a thin manila envelope. No return address. No markings. Just a single flash drive. She loaded it into her laptop with cautious hands, heart pounding. The contents were damning. Video footage of internal meetings, recordings of Richard discussing backdoor deals, falsifying reports, manipulating audits. It was more than enough to destroy him. Personally, professionally, legally. But Evelyn didn't forward the files to the press. Not yet. She closed the laptop and stared out the window, her reflection mingling with the rainy skyline beyond. She could ruin him in a heartbeat. She could dismantle everything he had built with one email. But she wasn't ready. Not because of fear. Not because of mercy, but because timing mattered. Justice needed precision. She would strike, but not when he expected it, not when he had his defenses raised. She needed a stage, a moment, a final performance where the curtain would rise and the truth would fall like thunder. And that moment was approaching faster than Richard could imagine. Richard Halston had always believed in noise. The louder the party, the brighter the lights, the more extravagant the gestures, the stronger the illusion of power. He had built his empire on spectacle and surrounded himself with voices that echoed his own. But now, the one voice that haunted him most was the one that remained silent. Evelyn had become a shadow in his home, not invisible, but unshakable. She said very little these days, but it was in her silence that Richard found himself unraveling. She moved through the estate like a calm storm, her presence unsettling in its restraint. She no longer confronted him, no longer challenged his decisions openly. Instead, she watched him. She studied him. Every glance, every pause, every polite smile was heavy with implications he couldn't decode. And that frightened him more than any raised voice ever could. He began avoiding her gaze during meals, retreating to his study for longer hours, speaking to Delilah with a nervous edge he couldn't hide. Even Delilah noticed it. "She's inside your head," she said one night, her tone dripping with irritation. "You're letting her win by doing nothing." Richard snapped. "I'm not letting her do anything. She's planning something, I know it." "Then stop her," Delilah hissed. "Before she stops you." But how do you stop a war waged in silence? Richard found himself grasping at shadows, reacting to ghosts. He combed through his financial records, rechecked board schedules, questioned his staff with increasing hostility, but nothing concrete surfaced. Evelyn had become a master of misdirection, dismantling his confidence one quiet day at a time. One morning, he received an anonymous package at his office. It contained a copy of a confidential document, an internal memo from a former executive who had been forced out after exposing fraudulent reporting. The document had disappeared years ago. It had been buried, destroyed, or so he thought. Now it was back, sitting on his desk like a ticking bomb. A single sentence had been underlined in red. "The manipulation of numbers under Mr. Halston's directive poses significant legal risk." No note. No explanation. Just that. Richard's hands shook. He locked the document in his drawer and stared at the door, half expecting Evelyn to appear. But she didn't. She wasn't behind that door. She was somewhere else, doing what she did best, watching, waiting, unraveling him piece by piece. That evening, as he arrived home, he noticed something strange. The staff didn't greet him the same way. Their smiles were restrained, their movements quicker, like people moving through a house they no longer trusted. In the hallway, Evelyn passed by him carrying a small bouquet of fresh lavender. She didn't say a word, just walked past with a gentle nod. But that nod, so calm and measured, shook him to his core. It wasn't passive anymore. It was victorious. Later, he found Delilah pacing in the sunroom, irritated beyond measure. "She's turning everyone against you," she snapped. "She doesn't need to say anything. They see it in the way she carries herself, in how you react to her. You've given her all the power without even realizing it." Richard glared at her, defensive. "I'm not giving her anything. I still run this house, this business, everything." "Then act like it," Delilah challenged. "Because right now, you look like a man waiting for a verdict." Meanwhile, Evelyn's connection with Marcus Vale deepened. They met discreetly, always in public places with no ties to either of them. At a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, Marcus handed her a small notebook filled with names, former employees, contractors, whistleblowers. "These people are willing to talk," he said. "On record. You just have to decide when to pull the trigger." Evelyn flipped through the pages. Each name came with a story, a wound inflicted by Richard's empire. Broken promises, ruined businesses, stolen futures. She closed the notebook carefully. "Soon," she said. But not yet. Back at the estate, Evelyn prepared for a dinner with one of the charity boards. It was a modest event, nothing extravagant, but she dressed with deliberate elegance. A navy blue dress, simple pearl earrings, soft waves framing her face. Richard watched her descend the stairs, frozen by the familiarity and strangeness of her beauty. She looked the same, yet completely different. She looked like a woman who had discovered her purpose. "You look sharp," he said, trying to mask the discomfort in his voice. Evelyn smiled faintly. Sharp things tend to cut deeper than loud ones. He didn't respond. He couldn't. He just watched her leave, and for the first time, he felt the walls of his home closing in around him, not from scandal or exposure, but from the weight of her quiet triumph. The next few days were a spiral. Investors pulled out of a major deal without explanation. A longtime client terminated a partnership citing unforeseen internal inconsistencies. News outlets began requesting interviews with Evelyn, not as Mrs. Halston, but as a respected figure in the nonprofit sector. The shift was palpable. Richard was losing ground, and Evelyn hadn't even said a single word to the public. Delilah became more volatile. She confronted Richard at every turn, demanding action, accusing him of weakness. "She's going to destroy you," she hissed. "And when she does, don't expect me to be here watching it happen." Richard, exhausted and cornered, finally shouted, "Then leave. If you can't handle this, then get out." Delilah stormed off, but not before spitting one last line that stuck with him long after she was gone. "She's not just your wife anymore. She's your reckoning." That night, Richard wandered the estate like a ghost. He found Evelyn in the garden, seated on a bench beneath the oak tree. He stood in silence for a moment, then finally spoke. "What are you doing to me?" Evelyn didn't turn to face him. "Nothing you didn't already do to yourself." "You're punishing me," he said, his voice low, tired. "No," she replied. "I'm simply choosing not to protect you anymore." Those words echoed louder than any scream. He stood there, unable to respond, while the wind rustled the leaves around them. The storm he had mocked was already here, and it didn't need thunder. It had her silence. The invitations were printed on thick, ivory cardstock, embossed with golden filigree, and sealed with the signature Halston crest. An exclusive gathering to celebrate the expansion of Halston Enterprises into international markets, or so the pretext read. But everyone in the upper echelons of society knew the true purpose. It was a reassertion of power, a desperate attempt by Richard Halston to remind the world that he still reigned. The mansion was transformed yet again into a spectacle of grandeur. Crystal chandeliers were polished to mirror clarity. A 10-piece orchestra tuned their instruments in the marble foyer, and imported orchids adorned every corner of the ballroom. Guests arrived in tailored tuxedos and flowing evening gowns, luxury vehicles lining the driveway like a parade of excess. Waiters glided across the polished floors with silver trays and champagne glasses, offering delicate hors d'oeuvres and practiced smiles. The mood, at first, was light and indulgent. Polite laughter, clinking glasses, murmured conversations about business and travel. But beneath the glittering surface, tension simmered like an ember waiting to ignite. Richard stood at the center of it all, dressed in a custom black tuxedo with a silk pocket square folded perfectly at his breast. He greeted each guest with charm so practiced it bordered on mechanical. Delilah, radiant in a silver gown that shimmered like moonlight, clung to his arm like a prize on display. She laughed a little too loudly, leaned in a little too close, kissed the cheeks of socialites she barely tolerated. But her eyes constantly scanned the room, searching for Evelyn. Evelyn arrived late. Not fashionably late, deliberately late. She entered alone, stepping through the grand doors in a deep wine-colored dress that hugged her figure with quiet elegance. Her hair was swept into a loose updo, and a pair of diamond earrings, her mother's, glinted softly beneath the chandeliers. Conversations faltered briefly when she appeared. Heads turned. Murmurs spread like ripples in water. Even Delilah's smile wavered as she saw the graceful figure glide into the room without hesitation or apology. Evelyn didn't seek attention, yet the energy in the room shifted as if gravity itself acknowledged her presence. Richard's eyes found her quickly. He straightened his posture, smoothed his lapel, and moved toward her, Delilah trailing behind like an afterthought. "You decided to join us after all," Richard said, voice laced with the smugness of a man trying to reassert control. "Wouldn't miss the show," Evelyn replied calmly, her eyes scanning the room before resting on his. "After all, it's not every day a man hosts a farewell party without knowing it." Richard raised an eyebrow, caught off guard by the comment, but before he could respond, Delilah interjected with a faux sweet smile. "Evelyn, you look different tonight." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Change tends to do that to a person." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving the two standing like mannequins in her wake. Throughout the evening, Evelyn moved through the crowd with deliberate ease, greeting old acquaintances, exchanging smiles, offering brief but impactful conversations that left people thinking long after she walked away. She wasn't loud or flashy, but she commanded attention through presence alone. Richard noticed. So did Delilah. And so did the man standing near the back of the room, watching quietly, Marcus Vale. He wasn't dressed like the others. A simple navy suit, no designer cufflinks, no bow tie. He blended in only by remaining still, speaking little, observing much. At precisely 9 o'clock, he moved toward the center of the room. He tapped his glass with a spoon, the sound crisp and clear. The music halted, conversations died, and heads turned toward him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice calm but firm, "forgive the interruption. I wouldn't speak unless it were something of great importance." Richard stepped forward, irritated. "Who are you, and what are you doing in my home?" Marcus smiled faintly. "I'm someone who believes the truth deserves a stage, especially when the lies have been so elegantly dressed." A hush fell over the room. Guests looked at each other with curiosity and unease. Delilah's grip on her clutch tightened. Evelyn, standing at the edge of the crowd, remained still. Marcus continued, "You've all been invited here tonight to celebrate an empire, a legacy. But what if I told you that legacy was built not on innovation or integrity, but on manipulation, deceit, and betrayal?" The air grew thick. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in closer. Richard tried to interrupt, but Marcus held up a hand. "I have documentation, proof, of fraudulent business practices, forged audits, and corporate sabotage. I have testimonies from employees discarded like tools, from families ruined by acquisition deals designed not to grow, but to dismantle. And I have names. Names like Lindale Holdings, like Halston Enterprises, like Richard Halston." The room erupted into a cacophony of whispers and gasps. Some guests turned to Richard, others looked toward Evelyn, whose expression remained unreadable. Richard's face flushed, but he forced a laugh. "This is absurd. Some disgruntled journalist trying to make a name for himself. Disgraced, maybe," Marcus said, cutting him off. "But not a liar. Every document will be sent to the media tonight. Every name, every detail. The world will know who you really are." Delilah's face drained of color. She looked around at the guests, the press, the investors. She saw the panic forming in their eyes, the doubt, the recoil. Richard's voice rose, frantic now. "You have no right. This is defamation. Truth doesn't need permission," Marcus replied. "It only needs courage. And someone willing to speak it." The room was spinning. Investors were already pulling out their phones, sending messages, making calls. The orchestra quietly packed their instruments and slipped away. The waiters vanished into the kitchens. Even the walls seemed to recoil from Richard's presence. Evelyn stepped forward then, calm and poised. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the chaos like a blade. There are moments in life when silence is no longer an option. This is one of them. She turned to Richard, meeting his eyes. "You built this empire on the ruins of others. And now, you'll feel what it's like to watch everything you created fall apart." And with that, the party continued to unravel, not with music, but with truth. Not with applause, but with revelation. Not with celebration, but with the first tremors of collapse. The morning after the party did not begin with the usual chirping of birds or the clinking of breakfast trays. It began with silence. A thick, oppressive silence that clung to the mansion like fog after a storm. Outside, the sky was gray, mirroring the mood inside the estate where whispers had become tremors, and tremors had become earthquakes. Richard Halston sat alone in his study, staring at the unread messages flooding his phone. His inbox was a battlefield, investors demanding answers, board members withdrawing support, news outlets requesting statements, legal teams urging immediate response. Headlines from every financial publication screamed the same truth he had tried so long to bury. Fraud, scandal, deceit. The Halston empire was cracking at the seams. He threw his phone against the wall, the sharp sound of its shatter echoing through the silence, but it solved nothing. The damage was done, and no amount of rage could piece back what had been exposed. The documents Marcus Vale had promised had indeed been delivered to every newsroom, every online platform, every contact list tied to Richard's career. Video evidence, signed contracts, forged financial statements, personal correspondences, all there, all damning. The media firestorm was instant and merciless. Words like embezzlement and corporate misconduct now preceded Richard's name in every headline. Reporters camped outside the gates, helicopters circled above, and once loyal partners now spoke of distancing themselves from the brand. Delilah stood in the foyer, bags in hand, her face pale and expression rigid. She watched Richard descend the staircase, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched, suit rumpled from a sleepless night. "You're leaving," he said, though it came out more like a statement than a question. "I don't do sinking ships," she replied, her voice void of affection. "You knew exactly what this was when I came into it. Don't look at me like I'm the traitor. You said you loved me," he muttered, eyes scanning her face for any softness. Delilah let out a hollow laugh. "I said a lot of things. So did you." She moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, "And for the record, you were never in love with me either. You were in love with the illusion I helped you create." Then she was gone, heels clicking across the marble, past the reporters, past the chaos, into a waiting car that disappeared around the corner without a single glance back. Richard stood motionless for a moment, then turned and walked back into the study. He poured himself a drink, though it was barely noon. His hands trembled as he brought the glass to his lips. Every sip tasted like regret. It was only then that he noticed the envelope sitting on his desk. No stamp, no postmark, just his name, written in Evelyn's elegant cursive. With slow fingers, he opened it. Inside was a single page, handwritten. No accusations, no anger. Just a letter. He sat down and read it once. Then again, and again. "Richard, I once believed silence was dignity. That endurance was strength. I thought that if I kept walking with grace, I could protect something sacred between us, even if it only existed in my imagination. But silence becomes complicity when truth demands a voice. You used me. You used my name, my trust, my family. You smiled at my father over dinner while plotting the acquisition that would bury everything he built. You promised partnership, but you only ever wanted ownership. I lived in your house, wore your name, bore your humiliations, and still I chose peace, for years. But peace built on injustice is a fragile illusion. It was never strength, it was survival. I didn't want revenge. I still don't. But truth has its own timing, and sometimes it demands to be seen. This is not about destroying you. It's about revealing you. So you can no longer hide behind charm and suits and chandeliers. So people can see the man you really are when the curtains fall. Goodbye, Evelyn." He let the letter fall to his lap, staring blankly at the floor. He wasn't sure what stung more, the clarity of her words or the absence of bitterness in them. She hadn't written to hurt him. She had written to set herself free. Later that afternoon, the board of directors formally announced an emergency restructuring of Halston Enterprises. Richard was asked to step down. The press release cited internal reorganization and reputation concerns, but the subtext was clear. He was being removed to salvage what was left. By evening, the markets responded. Stocks plummeted. Partners withdrew. One of his offshore accounts was frozen for further investigation. Legal proceedings were initiated. Evelyn watched it all from afar. She didn't gloat. She didn't speak publicly. She declined interview requests, issued no statements. But her presence in every headline spoke volumes. The woman once mocked as invisible had become the silent force behind a revolution. Her strength wasn't in vengeance. It was in grace under fire. Her dignity didn't scream, it resonated. In the days that followed, Richard's social circle disintegrated. Invitations dried up, calls stopped coming, and even casual acquaintances pretended not to recognize him. He wandered through his now quiet mansion like a ghost, alone, disgraced, forgotten. He spent hours staring at old photographs, wondering how it had all gone so wrong, trying to find the exact moment when he crossed the line from ambition to destruction. But the truth was, there hadn't been a single moment. There had been thousands, small, invisible choices that eventually built the empire that now crumbled around him. And Evelyn moved forward. Not with revenge, not with malice, but with purpose. Her quiet resistance had become a beacon. She began working closely with organizations that supported business ethics, using her story to inspire change without ever turning herself into a spectacle. Her father's legacy was no longer buried under Richard's empire. It had been reclaimed by her strength. The empire had fallen, but what rose from its ruins was something far greater than scandal. It was truth. It was grace. It was a woman once silenced, now heard by all. By the end of the week, the once mighty Halston estate no longer resembled the palace it had been. The silence that filled its vast halls was no longer elegant. It was oppressive. Chandeliers still sparkled, art still lined the walls, and fresh flowers were still placed daily by a staff that remained out of habit more than loyalty. But the soul of the house had shifted. It no longer pulsed with celebration or pride. It echoed only with the weight of a man's collapse. Richard Halston sat alone in the lounge, surrounded by remnants of a life he no longer controlled. Newspapers were scattered across the coffee table, every headline a brutal reminder of his public fall. Phrases like corporate corruption, internal fraud investigation, and disgraced millionaire were printed in bold, unapologetic font. Photos of him, once captured mid-toast or mid-laugh, now showed him stepping out of court buildings, flanked by lawyers with tight faces and reporters with aggressive questions. His name, once spoken with reverence, had become synonymous with scandal. The board had formally removed him from his position, and the company was being carved up and reorganized in an attempt to survive the PR catastrophe. His properties were under review, assets scrutinized, offshore accounts frozen. Delilah's departure had been swift and cold. No note, no goodbye, just silence and a lawyer to collect her belongings. Friends disappeared like smoke. Allies stopped returning his calls, and even the staff, though still present, carried out their duties with the detached politeness reserved for strangers. He could no longer walk into a room and feel control. He could no longer look in the mirror without seeing the man he'd become. It wasn't the exposure that haunted him most. It was the humiliation, the unraveling of everything he had pretended to be. One afternoon, he sat outside in the garden, staring blankly at the roses Evelyn used to tend. They were still there, blooming quietly, defiantly. His thoughts drifted back to her, to the sharpness in her silence, the grace in her distance, the power in the dignity she had never abandoned. He remembered her final words from the night of the party, the calm clarity in her voice, the way she had looked at him not with hatred, but with release. And he realized then, for the first time, that he had never really known her. He had never seen her strength because it had never needed to scream. It had always been quiet, steady, waiting. Legal notices continued to arrive daily. The investigations were piling up. Some of his business associates were being questioned. There were rumors of arrests to come, of charges that might extend beyond civil litigation. His lawyers had grown colder too, less confident, more cautious. Every meeting ended with uncertainty. Every phone call carried a deeper sense of dread. He tried to maintain a semblance of control, but it was a performance even he no longer believed. He walked through the estate like a man lost in a world that no longer responded to his presence. The walls didn't echo his footsteps with grandeur. They swallowed them in indifference. And then, one morning, the final blow arrived. A subpoena, not just for financial misconduct, but for knowingly suppressing employee whistleblower reports that could have prevented the loss of pensions for hundreds of workers years ago. It was no longer a matter of reputation. It was a matter of law. The next day, his mugshot appeared on the evening news. The image was surreal. Richard Halston, former titan of industry, photographed in a county detention center, expression vacant, suit wrinkled, dignity dissolved. The arrest wasn't violent, but it was devastating. Cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. Former colleagues distanced themselves even further. The Halston name, once etched in gold across business magazines and event banners, was now tarnished beyond recognition. But perhaps what marked his true downfall wasn't the legal action or the media frenzy. It was the silence that followed. The complete, aching silence of irrelevance. No one came to see him. No letters. No visits. No redemption arc from the people he once entertained. The mansion remained, but it felt less like a home and more like a tomb for the legacy he tried to craft out of deception. His fall wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was a slow disintegration. The kind that leaves a man staring at a cup of coffee he no longer enjoys, flipping through old articles about himself that feel like stories of a stranger. And Evelyn had not spoken a word to the press. She gave no interviews, declined all invitations to capitalize on the moment. but her presence remained everywhere. In the courtroom whispers, in the corporate restructuring meetings, in the quiet nods of respect from those who once looked past her. She didn't need to reclaim her place by standing on the ruins of his empire. She had already transcended it. Some said she had become the new face of quiet resistance in high society. Others saw her as a symbol of quiet revolution. But to those who truly watched, she was simply a woman who refused to let humiliation define her story. A woman who, when pushed to the edge, chose not to push back with anger, but with truth. A woman whose silence had spoken louder than any accusation ever could. One evening, Richard sat alone in the library, flipping through a dusty photo album. He paused on a picture from years ago, Evelyn in a simple white dress, laughing with her father in a garden. There was no wealth in the picture, no glamour, just warmth. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. He closed the album, set it aside, and leaned back in his chair. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just sat there, with the weight of everything he'd lost pressing into his chest like gravity. Because in the end, it wasn't the scandal that ruined him. It was his own reflection. And finally, for the first time in his life, he saw himself clearly. Weeks passed, but for Richard Halston, time no longer felt linear. Each day blended into the next in a slow-motion descent, not just into legal consequence, but into a profound personal emptiness. The estate had grown quieter, colder, despite the ever-burning fireplaces and the presence of the skeleton staff that remained, more out of obligation than loyalty. It wasn't just the empire that had fallen. It was the man himself, stripped of illusion, left staring into the chasm he had created. He sat most days by the large bay window overlooking the garden, where Evelyn used to spend her mornings reading. The roses she once cared for had begun to wilt, their petals sagging as if in mourning. He often sat in silence, watching them, unsure if he was seeing the garden or a reflection of his own decay. The media coverage had begun to fade, replaced by newer scandals and fresher names. But the damage lingered. The court proceedings continued behind closed doors, motions and hearings stacking like bricks in a wall he could no longer scale. The remaining assets were under constant review, and financial advisors now spoke to him like a fragile patient rather than a client. His name had been removed from the boardrooms, his likeness scrubbed from marketing materials, his legacy reduced to a cautionary tale in business schools and investor forums. The humiliation had become routine, and with it, a growing sense of isolation that gnawed at his edges more viciously than any prosecutor ever could. One morning, as he made his way to the front door to collect the mail, something he now did himself, finding strange comfort in the mundanity, he discovered a familiar envelope. It bore no return address, but he recognized the handwriting instantly. His breath caught in his throat. It had been months since he'd seen it, but that script, clean and deliberate, was unmistakable. Evelyn. He opened it slowly, hands trembling, unfolding the letter with care. There was no preamble, no greeting, just words, plain and powerful. Some things break loudly, others crumble in silence. But no matter the sound, the weight remains. You taught me that, without meaning to. He read it again, and again. It wasn't an olive branch, nor was it an attack. It was a statement of truth, simple and piercing. And it lingered longer in his mind than all the court documents and headlines combined. He placed the letter on the desk and sat there for hours, staring at it. He didn't respond. He wouldn't have known what to say if he tried. But something in him shifted. Something subtle but undeniable. That evening, he walked through the mansion alone, stopping in every room he had once used to entertain, impress, and dominate. He paused at every corner, touching walls, brushing his fingers across surfaces, trying to feel something beyond the cold texture of marble and glass. He walked past the dining room where he'd held his grand dinners, now empty and echoing with memory. He stepped into the ballroom, its chandeliers still intact, though they hadn't been lit in weeks. And then into the library, where he used to mock Evelyn for reading too much, for being too introspective. He stood there now, surrounded by the books she once cherished, the very ones he had dismissed. He pulled one from the shelf at random, sat in the armchair she used to favor, and opened it. Not to read, but to hold it, to feel the weight of something he'd never valued before. The silence in the room wasn't oppressive this time. It was honest. Later that night, he began making phone calls. not to lawyers or bankers, but to people he hadn't spoken to in years. Former employees, business owners he'd once bullied out of contracts, partners he'd strong-armed into submission. Some didn't answer. Others hung up. A few, cautiously, listened. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He simply acknowledged the damage he'd caused, one voice at a time. It wasn't redemption, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was something. A start. He began visiting places he hadn't seen in decades. Neighborhoods where his earlier ventures had uprooted communities. Small towns where factories had closed under his watch. He went without entourage, without press. No camera crews. No staged photographs. Just himself, in worn-out clothes and a weary heart. Some people shouted at him. Some ignored him. But a very few, listened when he spoke. And in those rare conversations, he offered not justification, but remorse. Honest, raw remorse. Not for the fall, but for what he'd destroyed along the way. One day, as he walked out of a small-town diner, a teenage boy approached him hesitantly. "Are you really the guy from TV?" he asked. Richard nodded slowly. "Used to be." The boy tilted his head. "You don't look like you used to." Richard smiled faintly. "I don't feel like I used to." The boy didn't respond, just nodded and walked away. But it stayed with Richard, because it was true. He didn't feel like the man he used to be. And maybe, just maybe, that was a good thing. Back at the estate, he started letting go of the things he once clung to. Sold the art, donated the suits, cleared the shelves of trophies and plaques that now felt meaningless. The house echoed more now, but it no longer felt like a shrine to his ego. It was just a place, empty and waiting. And in that emptiness, something new had space to grow. He often thought of Evelyn, not in bitterness, but in respect. He remembered her restraint, her kindness even in distance, the quiet way she had dismantled him without raising her voice. He wondered where she was, what she was doing. He hoped she was thriving. One evening, he picked up the letter she had sent and read it again, aloud this time, as though hearing her voice would bring her closer. When he finished, he folded it gently and placed it in a small wooden box, locking it away, not to forget, but to remember differently. Not as a symbol of pain, but as a lesson carved into the deepest parts of him. He no longer had a fortune, but he had something far rarer, a reckoning. And perhaps, in time, something more. Not redemption, not applause. Just understanding. Just peace. The city had changed, or maybe it was Richard who now saw it differently. The tall buildings no longer looked like monuments to ambition, but like hollow shells of dreams that forgot their purpose. The streets buzzed as they always had, but the faces he passed no longer looked at him with recognition or envy, only with indifference. He had become a stranger to the very world he once ruled, a man who used to shape boardrooms with a glance now reduced to walking alone with his coat collar turned up against the wind. And yet, he walked not with bitterness but with quiet introspection, his pace steady, his steps deliberate, as if retracing each decision that led him to this very moment. After everything, the trials, the interviews, the settlements, the slow liquidation of his empire, he had found himself living in a modest apartment downtown. It was nothing like the marble and glass palace he had built with Evelyn. The floor creaked when he stepped into the kitchen. The windows fogged in the mornings. The coffee machine took too long to brew. But it was his. Not a gift from success, not a trophy of conquest, just a place that echoed with silence he had earned. He began volunteering at a small community center a few blocks away, helping with youth programs and literacy outreach. It wasn't grand. It wasn't glamorous. But it felt real. There was no applause, no cameras, no recognition. Just people trying to build something better from whatever broken pieces life had handed them. He didn't introduce himself as Richard Halston. He didn't need to. Most of the young people there didn't know who he had been, and the few who did didn't seem to care. What mattered was whether he showed up, whether he listened, whether he tried. And he did. He learned to listen, really listen. Not with the intent to respond, but with the intent to understand. He read to children in the afternoons and taught basic financial literacy to single mothers in the evenings. He helped clean the kitchen after community dinners and spent hours sorting donations. It didn't erase the past, but it added weight to his present. One day, after finishing a workshop, he stepped outside and found Evelyn waiting near the gate. She wore a navy coat, her hair loosely tied back, her eyes calm but unreadable. For a moment, Neither of them spoke. The air between them was full of the history that had once bound them, and the pain that had torn them apart. He approached slowly, uncertain of her intention. "You look well," he said gently, not knowing what else to say. "So do you," she replied. "I heard you've been coming here." He nodded. "It keeps me grounded. It keeps me honest." She studied him for a moment, then looked toward the building. "I've been working with a foundation that partners with places like this. I didn't expect to find you here." "Neither did I," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "But I suppose life knows how to bring us back to what matters." They walked together down the street, slowly, as if both unsure how long this moment was allowed to last. There was no anger between them now, only something softer, a kind of mutual mourning for what had been, and perhaps a quiet respect for what had emerged from its ashes. "I've thought about writing to you," he said, eyes on the pavement. "But I didn't think I had the right." "You didn't need to," she replied. "I've been watching from afar, not out of curiosity, but out of hope." "Hope?" he asked, surprised. "Hope that you'd become the man I once thought you could be. Not for me, but for yourself." They paused by a small park bench, and she sat while he remained standing, unsure if he deserved to share space beside her. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said. "I don't even know if I deserve peace." "You're not looking for forgiveness," she replied. "You're living with consequence. That's heavier, and somehow more meaningful." He sat then, quietly, beside her. For several minutes, they said nothing. The city moved around them, unaware of the quiet reconciliation unfolding on that old park bench. Eventually, she turned to him. "What will you do now?" "Keep showing up," he said. "Keep doing the work. Keep trying to be someone different from the man who thought he could own everything." "Then you've already begun," she said softly. He turned to look at her, eyes filled with gratitude and something he hadn't felt in years, humility. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "Not just for what I did, but for who I was. For every time I made you feel small, invisible, unworthy." She didn't respond immediately. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "I wrote this a long time ago," she said, "but I never had the chance to give it to you." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single piece of paper, a quote, handwritten in her elegant script. "Sometimes, the strongest people are those who choose grace when they have every right to rage." He stared at it, then folded it gently and tucked it into his coat pocket. "Thank you," he whispered. They parted shortly after. No promises, no open doors, just an understanding. As she walked away, Richard remained on the bench for a while, watching the city, listening to the sounds of life around him. For the first time in years, he felt no need to rush, no desire to chase anything. He had lost everything, but gained something he had never owned before, clarity. His downfall had been public, his shame broadcast to millions, his name dragged through dirt and disbelief. But what rose from that wreckage was something quieter, something steadier. Redemption didn't arrive like a parade. It arrived like a whisper, a small seed planted in humility, watered with intention, and nurtured by the willingness to change. In the end, Richard Halston would not be remembered for the empires he built or the wealth he once flaunted. He would be remembered, perhaps by only a few, for the man he chose to become after everything was stripped away. And sometimes, that's the only legacy that matters.